Okay, perfect. We'll get started. It's 9 o'clock. My name is KrisAnn Norby-Jahner. I am General Counsel for the North Dakota School Board Association. I specialize primarily in education law and employment law, and know a number of you from our conferences and maybe from some of the programs we run. And today's Brunch and Learn is going to be about some important new legislation and required policy FFI regarding personal electronic communication devices, prohibition during instructional time. So I'm going to spend this webinar working through what the new legislation is, what the new law is that was finally passed, and then how we have updated template policy FFI and completely revamped it from its previous recommended optional form when schools were working on whatever personal electronic communication device prohibitions and limitations they previously wanted to have without a law in place, to now a required policy given the new legal requirements of the law that was passed this legislative session. So I'll begin by talking about a little bit how this law came to be. So there was a number of bills introduced on the Senate and the House sides throughout session related to primarily banning student use of cell phones. They got to be more informally known as the cell phone ban bills. Although the language in nearly all of them certainly encompasses more than cell phones. Cell phones were primarily discussed as a distracting item in our schools. We heard a lot of ideas, a number of restrictions were proposed, and there was a number of competing bills. We tracked, testified, and promoted a number of items on the NDSBA side, including we really wanted to see local control with our schools. A number of schools that we work with already had some sort of limitations or bans regarding cell phones and electronic devices already in place, whether it was through policy FFI or another internal policy that schools had adopted. Building to building, we saw a number of policies that were already in place at our schools, and we really wanted to, as much as possible, ensure that our member schools could maintain local control. But there was, of course, a testimony from schools themselves. We saw administrators, business managers, principals attend different sessions depending on the bill that was introduced, and we heard them speaking to the legislature about how they were looking for a law. They were looking for support from the legislature and to provide them with something in the law that would require some restrictions to give them support in their buildings to eliminate distractions. But NDSBA still primarily really focused on that local control because every school is so different. We have very large school districts, medium-sized, a number of small school districts throughout our state. And there are so many factors that go into the feasibility and practical approaches of banning or limiting electronic devices in schools. We really spent a lot of time testifying about the local control aspect. The other thing that we saw in a number of bills that were introduced was a lack of legal compliance with federal law exceptions. There are a number of electronic devices that have to be allowed under federal law, specifically disability and medical related laws, where students might be required to have electronic devices, say for medical monitoring purposes, or there are certain exceptions that could be outlined in a student's Section 504 plan, an accommodation plan, an IEP that identifies different types of electronic device supports or access to electronic devices that students have to have. And so early legislation really did not address the exceptions in a manner that we felt was acceptable. So we spent a lot of time working with our legislatures on these aspects. And so I hyperlinked some testimony that came out of the NDSBA, both before and after crossover, regarding what we were promoting. And I really think that we were making a lot of headway and doing some really good work for our members to find that careful balance. In the end, I think we were all very surprised when Governor Armstrong stepped in really quickly and testified on the bills that remained after crossover. His office had several recommended revisions. I include a photo of him testifying and providing what he rebranded a bell-to-bell ban on the use of all personal communication devices. The restrictions his office were proposing were much stricter than what we had been working on prior to crossover, and were different. NDSBA certainly provided input and did work with the governor's office and legislators on getting the bill to its final version into law. We did have some ability to work with those offices, but it was clear that a law was going to be passed, and it was also very clear that it was going to be fairly restrictive. And so what ended up happening was House Bill 1160 was approved pretty overwhelmingly on the House side, and then on the Senate side, almost unanimously after reconsideration. And that was the first bill to be signed by the governor on April 25th. Then Senate Bill 2354 was approved unanimously on the Senate side, still by a large majority on the House side, and signed by the governor on May 2nd. So that is what ultimately happened with these banned bills. So our final law is, we call it the electronic device ban because, again, it encompasses much more than cell phones. And we know that it will be under NDCC section 15.1-07, something after that. We don't know. We've reached out to Legislative Counsel to get the specific citation. A lot of time in bills, or maybe sometimes, the bills will identify exactly what the section will be named. Neither of these bills did identify what the actual section will be. So once Legislative Counsel assigns the actual section number, then we will know the specific reference. So when you get our template policy and you see us more, generally referring to North Dakota Century Code Chapter 15.1-07, that's because at this point, we wanted to get you a policy, but at this point, we don't know the specific section. But it will be in that chapter. And it will, it's a pretty detailed new section that prohibits public schools students from accessing personal electronic communication devices during instructional time. And instructional time, that's defined very, very broadly. That is the time from the start of the school day until dismissal at the end of the school day on school premises, for which the signal may be the ringing of a bell. It's a very broad definition. So we know that instructional time under the law, as the law is laid out now, will include structured or unstructured learning experiences. It's going to include recesses, lunch periods, times between classes. It's very broad. There are some specific exceptions, and we worked on some of these as well when revisions were accepted. Instructional time does not include private student travel time to and from area career and technology centers. One of the first pieces of testimony, that I know I watched the day the governor was testifying was really some immediate questioning from administrators saying, what about our CTE centers? What about students, high school students in particular, who are driving themselves to and from area career and technology centers? So instructional time does not include that private travel time. There could be a need that a student traveling needs to have their electronic devices returned during that travel. It also does not include private student travel time to other offsite learning experiences. That is another catch-all that is maybe an off-site learning experience that is separate from CTE, maybe a job shadowing, whatever that might be. And then instructional time occurring in virtual environments off school premises. This one was important to me because we do live in a time, and we have other legislation passed that speaks to virtual instruction, and we live in a time where we have more virtual instruction options. So I found it would be, at a personal level, I found it would be pretty not feasible for schools to enforce a cell phone ban, say if your school allows virtual instruction on an inclement weather day. But if I feared if there wasn't an exception to talk about instructional time occurring in virtual environments, how in the world would parents be able to enforce a cell phone ban in their own home? So that didn't seem feasible. So we were able to work a little on giving some exceptions to instructional time, CTE centers, offsite learning experiences, and virtual environments occurring off school premises. But the prohibition under the law during instructional time is that personal electronic devices must be silenced or turned off and securely stowed away and inaccessible to students. So it's a pretty strict ban. This includes public schools that provide pre-kindergarten, elementary, or secondary education, and that is going to include your area career and technology centers when those students are there. The law does not include private schools, homeschool environments, virtual schools, virtual instruction, or the North Dakota Center for Distance Education. And the law targets a wide range of personal electronic communication devices. So you have this strict ban during instructional time. How is personal electronic communication device defined? Like I said, it's much more expansive than just a cell phone. So it is a broad definition, and it's, quote, a portable electronic device capable of communication by voice, text, or other data with one or more other parties or devices, or capable of connection to a smartphone, the internet, or a cellular or wireless fidelity network. So it's very broadly defined. If you break it down under the law further, devices affected will include smartphones, cell phones, Bluetooth-enabled devices, tablets, smartwatches or other wearable devices, gaming devices. Really pretty expansive list. And I know there's been a lot of concerns about some of the items on this list, but that this is exactly how the law laid out. It does include even smartwatches or other wearable devices. And that, that has a greater effect on not just your older student population, but there are a lot of young elementary age children that certainly often wear gizmos or other types of smartwatches or wearable devices. So this is definitely professional development in a law that will need to be worked on at all levels in all of your buildings. Devices not affected, here are your the beginning of your very limited exceptions. School-owned devices provided to a student, right? So that could include laptop computers, if your school provides iPads or any sort of electronic learning device owned by the school provided to a student, or school-approved devices used by a student. We did hear throughout session testimony from some schools that said we don't have the funds or resources to provide iPads to our students. We allow iPads in for certain learning experiences, or we have teachers at our school that every year have a certain assignment that may require or allow students to use a personal phone and an app, and that's how we create these video modules or whatever it might be. There is a very limited exception under this law that allows schools to accept personal electronic devices that are school approved. So school-owned devices can be accepted, school-approved devices can be accepted. And I'll talk a lot more about school approval when we go through the template policy and talk about the way we drafted that to give some parameters to it to maintain the integrity of school approved for an instructional purpose. So I'll talk about that more later. Another exception is portable devices that meet the definition of a medical device under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Perhaps a student, for example, who is diabetic and has a blood sugar monitoring device that needs to be with them at all times. That would certainly be a portable device that likely meets that definition of medical device. So in the law, you will see how devices that are affected are kind of listed, and then a few of the exceptions are identified, and this is in the definition section right at the beginning of the law. There are additional required exceptions that must be made in accordance with law. So a school cannot prohibit a student from possessing a personal device if a licensed medical provider determines the device possession or use is necessary for, quote, the health or well-being of the student. So if a student brings in medical documentation from a provider, the school needs to accept that if the provider has identified a certain electronic device that may be necessary for the health or well-being of the student. Exceptions must also be made under a student's program, plan, or accommodation. So possession or use of a device is required if the possession or use of a device is required by the student's individual education program under the IDEA, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, or a plan developed in accordance with state or federal law requiring accommodation. Although IDEA and Section 504 and the ADA, all different laws, the meaning of this exception really is about typically addressing medical needs, disabilities, and required accommodations as identified in these structured plans that administrators and special education teams, teachers, school personnel work with in a team-like manner with parents to put together for a student. So if there's a particular electronic device that is identified in one of those plans or accommodation plans, those do have to be followed. And when we get to the policy and I talk about implementation, feasibility, how do teachers know who has what? I'll discuss that a bit more about really even outside of this new law, how your staff are supposed to know a student's plan and how that should be triggered, identified, etc. The law also very specifically requires, and this is why FFI has become a required policy template at the NDSBA, it requires a school to adopt a policy and implement that policy. And the law lists very specific inclusions that must be in that policy, which was in some ways made it easier for us to structure the restructure really policy FFI to make sure we were including all the provisions required in the policy under law. So the first part is the policy must have provisions related to a device ban during instructional time. So you will see in our policy template a requirement that all personal electronic communication devices be, again, silenced or turned off, securely stowed away, and inaccessible during instructional time. The policy also has to have, needs to have guidelines on whether and how the school may limit or allow student access to personal electronic communication devices outside of instructional time, including during a school-related activity. School-related activities could include a school-sanctioned activity, event, or function where students are supervised by the school, such as a bus ride, a field trip, sporting event, school dance. So that has to be another provision that is outlined under the policy. The policy also has to have, and this is very important, clear enforcement provisions, because smartly, I guess, what is a policy without provisions identifying enforcement? So we know that the policies the students or that the schools are adopting and implementing have to have clear enforcement provisions to ensure strict compliance with the policy by students and school employees. So the law really requires strict compliance by students and employees. So that puts a burden on schools to make sure students are being directed to follow the policy and that employees are making sure that students are following the policy and the law. And then the policy also has to allow for a process that allows a student to contact the student's parent or authorized caregiver during the school day if needed by using a school telephone made available to the student in a manner and location designated by the school. I know there's a lot of concern from parents about contact with their children during the school day, and the law specifically identifies that a policy has to outline the process or outline that they will have a process that allows the student to contact their parents on a school telephone. But the law is drafted to say parent or authorized caregiver. So when we get to the communication piece of the policy to parents, this is an important aspect to remind parents to have updated contact information, both for themselves or any other authorized caregiver that needs to be on file at the school as signed off on by the parent. After the schools adopt a policy, implement that policy, The law also identifies a communication and delivery requirement. So upon the adoption and implementation, the law requires a communication piece, ensuring the policy is communicated to students, parents, and authorized caregivers, and a piece that identifies student personnel handbooks, that the policy has to be published in student and personnel handbooks. Many school districts have, template policies or policies they draft on their own that, are at a higher level, and then also might have accompanying student handbooks and personnel handbooks. This policy needs to also get into those handbooks. An additional legal requirement under this new law is data collection and accountability. And we did help work on this a bit. The data collection accountability piece was often a piece that showed up in a number of bills to monitor and gauge the effectiveness of a ban of this nature. We saw a variety of original maybe versions that could even require annual reports to DPI. We don't have that in its final version. So in the final version, schools are required to collect data annually with the goal of measuring the impact of the policy on student behavior, mental health, disciplinary incidents, school attendance, and academic performance. But there is no standardized reporting requirement to the superintendent of public instruction. Schools just need to make a good faith effort in data collection, common sense approaches. There is no one way to collect this data annually. There is no one way for a school, as determined by the law, with how you might measure the impact of a policy on student behavior versus the impact of other factors that might also simultaneously be affecting student behavior, mental health, etc. There's no one way. So I do suspect this will be an area schools may have questions on, and we will see how this evolves, what approaches schools come up with. We are happy to help here at the NDSBA as well as schools work through this data collection process because it's brand new and it's brand new for everyone. But there is no required reporting requirement. It is an internal data collection requirement. So from beginning to end, that is what the law ended up being. So that is what we have. And as we do at the end of legislative session, the NDSBA, we have to go through all the template policies and make revisions according to the law that was passed. This was obviously a priority policy that we had to get working on right away to make sure that our school districts would have time to get this adopted, implemented, and then communicated it into those handbooks. So we do have released required policy FFI, personal electronic communication devices, prohibition during instructional time. Some of this will feel a little duplicative, but I just wanted to go over the law first to explain why and how we drafted the policy in the way that we did. So like most policies that you see in template form, the policy will start with a general policy statement, talking about the commitment to providing necessary support for our students, to providing an environment free from unnecessary non-educational distractions. That opening statement really gives what we would call your policy purpose, okay? The purpose of the policy to ensure that distractions are eliminated or limited in our school environments. So the overall policy purpose is to provide students with more opportunities to engage in meaningful interactions, collaborate with peers, and cultivate the essential skills necessary for academic and lifelong success. Therefore, it is the position of the state of North Dakota and the school district that students and school employees shall abide by this policy, which prohibits the use of personal electronic communication devices as outlined herein. That is how the policy begins, with the policy purpose statement. Then you will see that the policy walks through definitions. This is also very common, especially in required policies that are based on law, particularly North Dakota Century Code, where you will see a definitions section. So that is the next section you see in policy FFI. And the definitions for instructional time, the definition for parent, personal electronic communication device, school-related activity, and student, which I have walked briefly through in the previous part of this presentation. Those are all direct quotes from the law. There is not a deviation in the definitions offered under this policy than what the definitions are under the law. Those are the legal definitions. Original FFI, which was a policy that identified, limited or allowable student use of personal electronic devices before there was a law, also had a definition regarding inappropriate content. That is not in the term inappropriate content. When you see that in policy FFI, you will not see inappropriate content as a definition under the law, because the law, that is not from the law. That is from our original policy FFI. And you will understand why I left that in FFI, but it is primarily to identify in addition to the law, because remember, your minimum requirement is to abide by the law. Schools can also be more restrictive. You can't be less restrictive than the law, but you can certainly be more restrictive or add in addition to legal requirements. And this is one area where, in addition to the minimum requirements under the law regarding a ban, there could be, in addition, additional controls a school might want to incorporate or address in policy regarding when you are using electronic devices, school approved or school owned or whatever that might be, you cannot use those devices to access inappropriate content. So we left that in there, and you will see it makes sense when we walk through all of policy FFI. But the definitions are the first thing you will see. Then we walk through in the policy the prohibitions, because that is kind of the meat of the law. It is what your administration will be wondering, questioning, what do we need to follow? It's what parents will be wondering, what devices does this include? So we started with the prohibitions. We started with specifically breaking down the law even further away from that kind of legalese definition, and specifically listing out the prohibited devices. Again, the smartphones, cell phones, Bluetooth enabled devices, tablets, smartwatches, wearable devices, gaming devices, and then any other devices as defined under the Century Code. And then the actual prohibition itself, again, silenced or turned off and securely stowed away and inaccessible to students during instructional time. So we lay that out right after the definitions, because this is the prohibition. This is what people are wondering, and here it is. The district may develop additional administrative regulations or rules which outline the specific procedures each school building will follow to ensure all three legal requirements are met during instructional time. We did not want to, going back to the idea of local control and that all school districts are different and unique and have different layouts, different setups, multiple buildings. We have school districts with multiple school buildings and different learning levels to school districts with one K through 12 building, right? So what silenced or turned off and securely stowed and inaccessible to students during instructional time might not look the same across each building or across every school. So we did not in our template policy lay out exactly what we think securely stowed away will mean, or exactly what we would recommend inaccessible means. Those are areas that schools are going to have to work through at a building level. And so we do include in the policy kind of this notation about, developing additional administrative regulations or rules under kind of the theory of this local control aspect, so that schools can make sure they are accomplishing silencing, turning off, securely stowed away, making sure that those devices are inaccessible. So the policy will lay out the legal requirements, and there could still be additional administrative rules that administration will be working on to make sure that happens in your school. After identifying the actual ban itself, we walk through the exceptions. The school-owned devices provided to students, that's probably the easiest exception to identify under the policy, right? Because a lot of our schools offer school-issued laptops or tablets or electronic devices of some sort. When they're school-owned and school-issued, they can be exempt from the ban. School-approved devices used by student, this is the very limited area where schools have some discretion to provide approvals on a limited basis. But we wanted to be really careful when we were drafting this section in its template form to make sure that any approval being provided for students to bring in personal electronic communication devices, that they have some sort of approval related to an educational purpose. We fear if this provision gets abused, for lack of a better term, by schools, used too often, or used in a manner that is not connected to an educational purpose, you might be looking at future legislation that takes this away. And we don't want to take it away. It's our one little small piece of local control. So we tried to draft this in a narrow form to connect it to approval for an educational related purpose. And to also note that such approval shall be limited in scope and time according to the specific educational related use of the approved device. And also noting students who have received that approval shall only use that device for that specific educational related purpose and not for another purpose. And any violation of this provision by the student or employee may result in approval being rescinded and the student and or employee being subject to discipline as identified in this policy. So our recommendation really is that approval that is given is limited in scope, limited for a specific educational related purpose, and that this approval process is not abused. You will see in the policy brackets that leave it up to the school to determine who in a school may have that approval ability. It might be administration, perhaps a classroom teacher. That is a decision to make at a district level. Who is allowed to make this approval? And again, some examples might be a teacher who wants to have a certain project in their classroom, and maybe you don't have the district resources of an electronic device that has an app that a teacher wants students to be able to use. So maybe student is allowed to bring any personal tablet or personal cell phone that has that particular app for that particular school project. That would be an example where maybe a teacher or an administrator would give approval. Just one example, but that was a section we took some careful time in drafting to make sure that we really were keeping with the spirit and intent of the electronic device ban and really narrowly tailoring this school approved exception piece. If there are questions, you'll have to let me know. I don't see the questions.
Hear me, KrisAnn?
Yeah, Sheila, are there questions? I see the chat.
Yes, there's a question. So staff, teachers, and admins are not allowed to use personal electronic devices as well?
Thank you. I had the chat open. I didn't have the Q&A open. My apologies. No, that staff, teachers, and admin are not included in the laws banned. Staff, teachers, and admin are not allowed to use personal electronic devices as well. No, the law only talks about a prohibition on students. So under the law, the prohibition on the use of the electronic devices that I've identified and talked about is on students. However, strict compliance is required by students and employees. And when I say strict compliance, that means students have to comply with not using electronic devices, having them stowed away, having them silenced, etc. And strict compliance by employees means employees have to make sure that happens. So teachers cannot allow students to be using personal electronic devices in their classrooms unless an exception applies. And administrators cannot allow students to be using personal electronic devices, or administration cannot allow teachers to be allowing it, that sort of thing. So that's what strict compliance means. We will get to a part in the policy where we address employee use and do provide an option. Again, districts can certainly be stricter than what the law requires. And right now the law requires a ban on student use, but schools can start certainly within their discretion put limitations on employee use. That's not going to be required under the law, but it is an option. So I will talk about the employee parts, the employee expectations when we get to that part. In elementary school, our students have lockers in the hallway. Would it be acceptable to have students store their devices in their lockers if they don't have access to them during the day, other than getting dressed for recess, or should I find an alternative option? I can't give specific legal advice on specific situations. Districts, of course, can, reach out to us and engage in that program. But I will say in general, I do think we will get similar questions about lockers. And, presumably, yes, I would imagine that would be a reasonable reading of the policy, as long, because you got to remember, instructional time, inaccessible, stowed away, silenced or turned off, lockers could be an option. I mean, I would imagine they probably can. So I know that when it comes time for administrators to be working on what stowed away and inaccessible means for their particular school, I suspect we're going to get a lot of questions on that. I guess stay tuned. I know that will be coming. The other device exceptions, I already talked about this, but this is what you will see in the policy. Then we walk through the medical provider recommendation, determining health or well-being of student, and then those required accommodations that are required under federal law. So I talked about both of these. Those are listed in the policy as required device exceptions. Another portion, I'll get to that question. Another portion of the policy is related to school-related activities, limitations / allowances for school-related activities, because that is identified under the law and requires schools and policy to identify what those guidelines will be. So again, the school-related activities would be bus rides, field trips, sporting events, school dances, or other activities where students are under supervision of school, whether on or off school premises. And in our template, we have a section regarding the school-related activities. That is another discretion piece where schools will need to determine, and maybe they already, I mean, let's be real, most of our school districts have policies or expectations currently in place. You might already have policies or expectations in place regarding these events, bus rides, field trips, sporting events. And so the law does allow you some discretion, whether those devices will be allowed in a limited capacity or a full access capacity, whatever that looks like. So the policy has a section on that. Additional prohibitions that we left in from original policy FFI: if a student is using a school-owned or approved device, a personal device on a limited allowed basis, or a personal device under another exception, because now we've talked about a lot of exceptions that could apply when a student might be using a device. We did leave in these original prohibitions, which are pretty common sense. So you won't find these in the law, but we think they're still important to include. Students cannot use any device to violate student conduct policy, cheating, bullying, etc. Students cannot use devices to photograph or record or transmit photo or video unless approved by principal for a classroom activity or other exception. They cannot photograph or video record inappropriate content and or transmit inappropriate content. And remember, I left that definition in at the beginning of the policy regarding inappropriate content. Students cannot use device in areas where reasonable expectation of privacy might exist. You could think bathroom, locker room. Students cannot use devices to compromise district networks or access confidential material. No hacking, trolling, spamming, sending viruses, engaging in illegal or inappropriate activity, etc. And students cannot use devices disruptively or in a manner that compromises safety or self or others. So these are some of the original prohibitions that were in our previous recommended policy FFI. And I think they're still, we think they are still important to include. That even when an exception applies, it applies for that specific accepted purpose. And all of this other conduct is never going to be allowed. So speaking of original policy FFI, Patty says, I had a question from a superintendent asking if FFIE, personal technology use and waiver liability, is still valid with the updated version of FFI. No, I believe, and Lexi can chime in if she's on, I believe that's been pulled actually, and won't be accessible. It's hard for me to think off the top of my head, but that FFIE really was drafted and formed with the original recommended policy FFI, which was a policy that allowed electronic devices. Now remember, this policy is a total shift and a complete ban. So it doesn't fit anymore. FFIE really doesn't fit. Now in the future, could it make sense to maybe for the NDSBA or a school district for its own purposes to have certain forms that accompany this policy? For instance, maybe a form regarding a school approved device and what that looks like, the limited purpose, the scope. Maybe we'll work on something like that down the road, but that original E really does not fit anymore with this ban policy, if that makes sense. So the original policy FFI was like, this is when devices might be allowed. This is when they might be limited. Here is, a scope, a waiver form for when students are bringing devices into school and using them. Well, now students are not allowed to use those devices. And there's going to be such limited exception that allows student use that form doesn't really fit anymore. The student contact with parents and caregivers. Oh yeah, thank you, Alexi. FFIE is no longer valid. Yes, remove the exhibit if your district currently has it in the manual. Perfect. Student contact with parents, caregivers. I know this is an important concern of many of your parents, maybe your students as well. The law does require a policy to outline that a student can use a school telephone made available in a manner and location designated by administration. We also included language that discusses student contact with parents and caregivers will not be unreasonably withheld, but superintendent may develop administrative policies and rules to ensure orderly operation of the school and educational processes are not disrupted. And then we are, asking those accessing the policy, parents and staff, to refer to other policies and regulations which may apply in the event of school emergencies, student emergencies, and other health and safety events that may occur. We know that schools will get pushback in this area and will get questions in this area. But the law is what it is, and this is how the law is drafted. This is what it says. So there is a small section in the policy that does discuss student contact with parents and caregivers. And again, during the communication piece of this policy, it is a good idea for schools to remind parents to make sure they have updated contact information and that they have identified any other authorized caregiver or student contact individual in whatever process schools use to capture that information, but it can be parent or other authorized caregiver that has allowed that contact with students. So parents should make sure that information is up to date. The enforcement provisions. This is an area where this is it. This is during legislative session, we were talking about feasibility of implementation, how schools are going to implement that. Here's our enforcement provisions. The law requires, and this goes back to that question about what the law requires of employees, but the law requires strict compliance with state law and policies. Any employee who knowingly allows students to access and use personal electronic communication devices that do not fall under a policy exception, that is in violation of this policy when the student is under the employee's supervision, that employee may be subject to discipline up to and including termination. This is kind of the standard language we have in an effort to help districts identify their enforcement provisions. So what we did in the policy is we outlined two categories of expectations. The expectations for employee for strict compliance, and then separately the expectations for students for strict compliance. So we start with the employees in the policy, and we have various provisions. It says, in complying with this policy, the following school employees' expectations apply. So we have a section that talks about school staff reporting requirements. Students shall direct students under their supervision or instruction to comply with this policy and shall report alleged violations to administration. We outline it in this way to try and keep with the way that a school would very likely handle most student discipline. You know, at the instruction level, when a student is under a teacher or an aide or whomever's supervision they might be in that moment, supervision or instruction, you would always want them to comply. Those individuals would always be tasked with making sure students follow code of conduct policies, including this policy. So, for example, if a teacher is teaching and sees a student pull a cell phone out of their bag, that is a violation of policy, right? Teacher would instruct student that has to be stowed away in whatever manner that building has identified and would correct the student. And the teacher should report that to administration, what occurred. If a teacher is not doing this and there's a complaint filed, hey, so-and-so is allowing students to use phones in their room, or so-and-so is not following this policy, we would recommend addressing complaints against staff or employees under current complaint procedures. For instance, recommended policy KACB, that is the personnel complaint form. In essence, meaning that that complaint would go to administration to investigate and respond to. It should be it's our recommendation that it really should be an administration investigating and making final determination of student violations and policy violations. If the complaint is against an administrator who your principal is not following this policy at a building level, is not making sure that teachers are complying, is not making sure students are complying, then that should be handled under your normal complaint investigation policies, where that administrator's direct supervisor would look into the allegation. So that's kind of how we have it laid out. The identification of policy exceptions, I know, I'm sure a number of schools have had this feedback. We have received quite a bit of feedback during policy drafting at the NDSBA from concerned constituents, members of the public, whomever it might be. How will an employee, teacher, staff member, administrator know about a student who has been granted an exception, a student who has an accommodation, a student who has a school approved advice, etc.? In policy, we talk about how school employees must identify and review any exceptions listed in students' program or plan. At a teacher level, that should happen anyway. Federal law requires those teachers and instructors who have students in their room under their instruction, if that student has a plan, whether it is 504, whether it is a medical accommodation or a health plan, whether it is an IEP, those school employees are supposed to know. So that if you're following the law, if your teachers and administrators are following the law in that manner, they're going to know when exceptions are allowed. What about on hallways? We've received concerns. What if a teacher is standing there, sees a student that they do not instruct, have a phone or have a tablet, and then they just jump in and instruct that student to put it away, and then that puts the burden on the student to say, well, I have an accommodation, and now you're in public and you're talking, or you're in a milling hallway with other members of the student body and employees milling around, and now that student is tasked with identifying themselves of having a disability, and that's confidential information. That's a real concern. It is. And so in this policy, we were trying to strike a careful balance of making sure teachers are instructing and staff members who are in direct supervision and instruction over a student, making sure that they are instructing them to follow this policy. But we want to avoid those situations, for example, in a hallway or in a lunchroom, or where teachers or staff members of any kind might very vigilante jump in and start getting after students who maybe have a diabetic blood sugar monitor, or might have an iPad because they are supposed to have it. These are going to be day-to-day operational issues that administration are going to have to keep a handle on. But I think it comes down to a lot of professional development and training with your staff on what the parameters are and when teachers should step in and when they shouldn't, because you do have to be very mindful of the students who have legally required exceptions and who have whose even status as a disabled student or student in need of accommodation is confidential. So we want to avoid overreacting when a student has a device and when an exception could apply, but certainly identifying, I see this happening. That student's not under my instruction, but I'm not certain that they should really be having that. Maybe then you report to administration, and administration should have a very good handle on those who have exceptions in their building, or should be able to quickly identify that information. It's not perfect. I don't know that anyone at the NDSBA has a perfect template, especially in our very large school districts, for how to identify and handle these one-on-one situations. It's exactly why we were testifying so hard for local control, because the feasibility and the practicality is going to come here during the expectation of strict compliance. So we're always happy to help talk you through these situations when they occur, or when administration is making administrative regulations and rules, working with staff, doing professional development. You can contact your current legal counsel. You can reach out to our legal programs. We're happy to try and work through these issues with you, because we are working through them alongside of all of you, based on your very different needs in different districts and different buildings. We do include, kind of in the vein of identifying students with exceptions and accommodations, we do have a section that talks about employees, the expectation that employees comply with federal law and those exceptions that are required. That will be important. Is there an administrative rule being written for this policy update? Maybe. If we see the need, and as we can get our hands maybe more around what implementation would look like in the districts, I don't think that's probably out of line, that perhaps we could work on an administrative rule. But at the same time, we don't want to be so heavy-handed in making districts feel like they have to follow what we put together at the building level, but maybe, Dave, maybe down the road. And then we have a section in the employee expectation discipline that talks about employee use of personal devices. And that goes back to the previous question, asking about what about employee use? We do include language in the policy that says there's an expectation for employees to follow acceptable use of technology. That's a separate policy in the I think field, in the A naming. AC, I don't want to say, I'll say it wrong. But there's an acceptable use of technology policy. So we kind of note and cross-reference that policy, that employees are expected to follow that, and other code of conduct policies. We have in brackets some optional language if a school wants to go further and put limitations or additional expectations, prohibitions, whatever that might be, on their own school employees. This would be the place to do it. This could certainly be the area you would do that. Again, the law does not require that, because the law talks about student use and directs strict compliance with a policy banning student use. But that does not mean the districts cannot go further and cannot address their own employee use. This could be, I mean, this is definitely a district to district decision. Maybe, a building to building decision. I don't know. It depends on your school district, the challenges you might have, the needs you might have, issues you might be facing. But you certainly could prohibit employees or limit employees in some manner if you want. I can imagine that it could be a bit of an administrative nightmare if students are now strictly banned from personal electronic devices, but teachers or staff members are now texting or on social media during instructional time, or making TikToks during instructional time. That are not education related, but are personal. There could be challenges in that area. So we wanted to include the option because, you might get pushback if students are held to one standard and employees are held to no standard at all. So that is a decision for the districts to make, how they want to address employee use. After we walk through in the policy what we would recommend the employee expectations be, Then we walk through student expectations. In complying with this policy, the following school employee expectation, well, I should have changed that. I apologize. It should say school student employee or school student expectations apply. There's a general policy statement at the beginning that talks about strict compliance required by students. Students found to have violated the policy may be subject to disciplinary consequences and/or corrective measures. Recommendations that administration take into account totality of circumstances, and infractions of policies incur when a student knowingly and willfully violates this policy as determined by administration. That is our recommended language. I mean, I think if there is a student violating the policy, most likely it's going to be knowing and willful. I mean, maybe there'll be some learning curves at the beginning and you will have students say, well, I had no idea. I don't read the student handbook. I don't follow the law. I didn't know I couldn't have this. Unlikely, I'm sure schools are going to do a very good job of communicating and getting this information out regarding this new law, the new expectation, etc. So infractions are most typically going to be when a student knowingly and willfully violates the policy. We include two options in the policy. You could allow a discipline matrix to be identified outside of this policy. So in that event, if a school wants to have a separate discipline matrix, in the student handbook or in a separate document, then you might use the policy language that says something like the district may develop administrative regulations or rules outlining specific disciplinary procedures to ensure compliance with this policy and the law. That allows maybe your administrators to work on what they want discipline to look like, for first violation, second violation, knowing violation, whatever that might be. Another option is that you could list the discipline matrix directly in this policy. And to be helpful to that extent, the NDSBA put together a sample discipline matrix, loosely based off another matrix that we've seen in another state that schools could certainly work off of, use, put in the policy directly. So really two options, having the discipline matrix in this policy itself or outside of this policy. But that strict compliance component, we really do feel has to come with identification that there is some sort of discipline matrix associated with students who might violate the electronic device ban policy. That is an expectation of the law. We do have some additional guidelines for disciplinary measures, and some of this comes from original policy FFI, and then others of it just comes from an attempt at providing some common sense approaches. When I said staff should be directing decisions about student violations to administration, we give a guideline on that. Staff members shall direct students to comply with the policy. That makes sense. And should report alleged infractions to administration. But our recommendation is that administration makes the determination if there's been an actual infraction of this policy, and that it is administration that administers discipline. And that's common sense, and that's not going to be different than how most code of conduct violations would be handled, right? For your students, that's going to go to the administration for determination. If a student refuses to comply, if administration determines a student is in violation of the policy and this student refuses to turn over device to administration, stow it away, whatever that looks like, the infraction may move to the next level. We would probably recommend that in your discipline matrix. This next guideline is from the original policy FFI, and we kept it in there. At no time should a school administrator or staff member attempt to physically or forcibly take an electronic device from a student. We would not recommend getting into some sort of tug of war or potential damage of property. You can follow your discipline matrix, put those consequences in place in that manner, but we would recommend avoiding that sort of physical confrontation. We also wanted to note other policies and compliance with those other policies. Administration may also respond under other conduct and disciplinary policies and regulations when a student's conduct implicates additional policies. That could include violence, threats of violence, harassment, bullying, or any other unlawful conduct or student code of conduct violation. It seems important to note that because there could be times when a student or employee, I guess, but primarily students are violating policy and also engaging in bullying or also engaging in harassment or something of that nature. Like while they're violating policy, now they're also doing this. Don't forget that other policies might intersect and have to be handled as well. And then we just can't emphasize the federal law exceptions enough. I just know that schools are going to get pushback in this area, and making sure that their student who has accommodation is not stopped in a hallway, is not called out in class, is not highlighted in any way, because now we have a building full of students who are not allowed electronic devices, but their student has one. I've heard the argument that the very nature of a student being allowed a device under a legally allowable exception discloses that student's disabled status. I don't know how to get around that when you have to implement a ban for everyone, but then also allow exceptions for others. So we put this, again, we emphasize the federal law exception so many times throughout the policy because how important it is, but we're also very mindful. Here's another feasibility, practicability approach that can be tricky and also come with a lot of legal liability. So when schools get into these situations with these federal law exceptions, complaints from parents of disabled students, you really need to work with your legal counsel. I think we can't emphasize that enough. Searches of personal technology, there's a section in here on that, and that again comes from the original FFI, talking about when searches could be allowed, threats, danger, potential harm, violation of the law, the areas of the search. This is all from original FFI, reasonably related in scope, only for the purpose of the authorized search. And then at what point administration might find the need to notify the school resource officer or law enforcement. If they suspect a device contains content in violation of the law, might contact law enforcement. I cannot emphasize enough, schools should not download or transfer sexually explicit content from a student's personal technology. Please do not do that. And law enforcement might step in these moments as well. So this is originally, I won't go over that in detail. That is not in the law. This searches piece is from our original FFI. And then back to legal requirements, the dissemination and education. The policy has the language upon adoption and implementation of the policy. The school must ensure the policy is communicated to students, parents, authorized caregivers, and publish the policy in student personnel handbooks. That is the final step that is required. And this communication piece might look different for every school district, but make sure that gets accomplished, particularly in the handbooks, which might be posted online. Notifying parents ahead of the new school year, what the expectations are going to be, that sort of thing. As schools review and revise the policy, as it deems necessary, when you work on your handbooks, if you need support, you can certainly reach out to us. We talked about school administration developing potential guidelines. That is probably a necessity. And the professional development, I know, at the beginning of every school year, staff often come back for development. I think this is probably going to be a pretty big professional development piece to make sure that your teachers, your staff understand this new policy and what the legal requirements are going to be and what the stowaway inaccessible pieces are going to look like in your building. And then I talked about the annual data collection documentation. Again, the law provides no other guidance or directives on what data collection must be. So that is going to be a piece that is within the discretion of schools. And, we can certainly help with that along the way. And just overall, I know I personally feel very ingrained in these cell phone ban discussions. I've been living in this world for a long time now, since the first bill was introduced at session. So I've heard all the arguments. The proponents really have the intent that this ban is going to reduce distractions in the education environment, improve academic performance, promote healthier social interactions. And, I certainly hope that's all true. Critics have absolutely voiced concern over limiting access during emergencies. We hear a lot about that. Personal downtime that students might have during their day, and student use for instructional time for instructional purposes. And also just the practicality and feasibility of implementing such a strict ban, especially in districts with large student populations, multiple release times. There's definitely going to be challenges. And so we definitely hear that critical approach. Overall, the law does allow for those exemptions, the exceptions. Staff, needs to be advised and counseled on this. We know that the compliance with the stowed away and inaccessible provisions are going to vary from school to school, which is why we did not get too deep in the policy about what that might look like for each individual school. The investigation and response procedures, we really, think that should be handled in accordance with current policy. We really think professional development will be important. And whatever system each school comes up with for data collection, soliciting feedback from your school boards, from your administrators, your teachers, staff, and students. I didn't put that in there, and students. That's important for future legislative sessions if this law is revisited again. Again, NDSBA, we have policy services related support. Always happy to provide general counsel on this policy in general, on the law in general, but if you need direct legal advice, you can, seek counsel from your school district's current attorneys. You can also utilize our Legal Direct and HR Direct programs, which allow us to give that specific legal counsel on specific circumstances, matters that arise, your handbook policy drafting review, or legal counsel on the specific data collection compliance efforts that you might want reviewed or discussed. So those are these are the highlights for our new law and the law that we have rolled out. I don't see any more questions, but I know many questions will be forthcoming. Amy or Lexi, did you have anything more you wanted to share on our law and our policy?
I don't have anything to share, KrisAnn. I thought you did a really good job. I guess what I would just say is just reinforce what you've already said. I think the implementation, again, the reason that we didn't get too far into the weeds in the policy on specific implementation is because it's going to vary significantly from building to building. I think the challenge is going to become that what does stowed away and inaccessible mean in each school district? I think that is the piece. And I think even the exceptions piece and the strict compliance piece are going to be issues that we're going to be coming back next session to talk about. That maybe we need to make some adjustments in the law to make that more workable. But I think what we would just encourage school districts to do is to do their best to comply, ensure as substantial compliance with the law as possible. But if you are running into issues practically, because I know just for example, a lot of schools don't have lockers anymore or don't have enough lockers for every student, especially our large districts. And so where do they stow away and make phones inaccessible? That I think is going to be one of the most challenging aspects of this new law. Again, we are, like all of you, we're all tasked with trying to figure out the best way to structure this so that we can comply with the law. But I do feel like this is going to be a challenge, as I'm sure all of you are anticipating as well. But we would really encourage that feedback from you. If certain aspects of the new policy are making it difficult, or if you'd like some additional language or modifications, let us know and we can help work through that stuff with you as well. Otherwise, and Lexi says she doesn't have anything else to add as well. So yeah, that's all I have. KrisAnn, you did a great job.
All right. Thanks, Amy. Yeah, we do appreciate the feedback. We work really hard to get the policy as good as we can, but then when you start using it, that's when we know, that's when we really find out how well it works or not. So yes, please do provide us feedback.
And I'll just mention that do not have a July Brunch and Learn. We give that month off just because usually a lot of folks are either hopefully taking a last minute vacation prior to the upcoming school year or getting prepared for the upcoming school year. So we don't have one currently scheduled for July. But we do have board member boot camp scheduled for August 7th. It's a virtual again this year, and registration is open. So you should have received communication from us about that. So please, board members, whether you're a newer board member or a veteran board member, we would encourage you to register for that. Again, it's on August 7th, 2025. I think we start at 8:30 in the morning. So with that, unless KrisAnn, if you have any other questions, we can send people
I'm good.
on their day.
Thanks, everyone.